as long as it is used for this purpose. What we'll be doing together in this session is just to go through an overview of what's expected. However, let me so here the market expected.
Sorry, guys, we had a technical problem. Bear with us a little bit more, please. Thank you.
Science, of course, anyone can use it as long as it is used for this purpose. What we'll be doing together in this session is just to go through an overview of what's expected. However, let me say a couple of things related to this issue. Number one, this is mandatory. In other words, there is no way away from it or any shortcut. You need to watch all these episodes, all these sessions. Each one of them is covering that you will handle during your research. Second, in a way or another, you will need to use practically every item that I'll be discussing with you in this series of sessions. In other words, you cannot just escape one saying it is not applicable to me. What I'll be explaining is flexible enough, is wide enough, is broad enough to accommodate all sorts of research, whether you will be doing historical analysis, doing descriptive analysis, exploratory analysis, quantitative analysis, qualitative analysis, anthropological, philosophical, sociological. It doesn't matter. All these are just, we can say, different ways to achieve the same goal, which is to move from what we know to understand we do not know. This is basically what research is. I will show you a whole list of the steps that we will go through throughout these sessions, and I will spend some time explaining each one of them and how they work. Session or in this session, all I will be doing is just to explain them somehow in a nutshell. It's a long list, but meanwhile, I have to make sure that you understand the big picture. Then we're going to dissect each one of these components and spend some time understanding each one of these cells that you see in front of you. Number one, you need to have a title. By the way, the title is the last thing to write eventually. In other words, you might just suggest a title for yourself, come up with a few words to explain what your research is going to be about, but you can change it, of course, with the consent of your mentor or your professor or supervisor. But eventually, you need to give us a title that has certain characteristics. I'll explain the characteristics later. It has to be, of course, very vivid, very accurate. It has to be somehow catchy, and so on. But the title can change. You can modify it along what you are doing, but it's like your suit or your dress. It needs to fit you neatly. It needs to be your size, the size of your research. Along with it, you need to write an abstract, usually 250 words, 300 words, but this abstract is for me, when I read it, is some kind of telling me what the topic is and what your main findings are, and give me an idea about your theoretical framework, your research design, your approach, so I understand. So instead of me going through the whole study, 20 pages, 30 pages, I can just in 200 words, 300 words, I understand what this is about. This is some kind of a service that you do to others to help them understand what your topic is about and what your study is doing. Number two, you need to tell us what your research problem is. Usually the title gives us the topic. Okay, the topic is Iraq. The topic is Egypt. Okay, what about Egypt? What about Iraq? What about whatever, USA? Okay. Now you need to give me something more detailed, more problematic, more perplexing. So I need to think what this is. What is the mission you assign for yourself in this study? What you're going to do? For instance, okay, the president of France has just said a week ago something like Islam is in crisis everywhere. Okay, what does he mean by that? For us as people who study political science, okay, this might mean something. We need to understand what it is. I'm going to examine what he means by crisis, what he means by Islam. Okay, here I need to assign myself a mission. What's Islam? What types of Islam exist in this world? What does he mean by the word crisis? Is it a crisis with modernity, a crisis with democracy, crisis with economic development, with equality, with globalization, with what? Okay, so we need to examine the word crisis and what it means. We might need to do some kind of content analysis to understand the context of what he was talking about. Is he talking about crisis of Islam, quote unquote, or between brackets might be Muslims in Europe? Okay, I need to analyze that. So I'm not now, the topic might be Islam / Muslims, but what about Islam and Muslims that I'm interested in? This can take the form of either a question or a hypothesis. A question can be, while other major religions, you can limit it to Abrahamic religions like Christianity or Judaism, seem to be compatible with modernity and its main notions or ideas, Islam is still struggling behind. Here you came up with an interesting observation. Okay, it seems that Christianity is relatively okay with modernity, secularism, separation between church and state, centers of religion and centers of decision making. Okay, what about Islam? Is it the case or no? This is not the case. Okay, so why so? This is an interesting question to ask. Okay, while other Abrahamic religions or religions, you can talk about Hinduism. Later on, I'm going to tell you that you need to make sure that all the major concepts you will be using, you need to shed some light on so I understand. Okay, so while religions in general mutated, changed, developed, to end up being incompatible with modernity, you are going to later on define what modernity is. I cannot understand what you have in mind, what modernity is. So we need to do conceptualization. That's a later thing to say. But modernity is an important term. While Islam is lagging behind, while Muslims are lagging behind. So we're going to use Islam, or we're going to be using Muslims, okay? Because if you're going to use the word Islam, this means most likely you will be using the texts. So you need here to be very careful. Do the texts of Islam, the Quran, the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, really obstruct modernity? Capitalism, democracy, liberalism, freedom of expression, freedom of worship, and so on. Or actually the problem is not the text, it's not Islam, it is Muslims. So here you are going to be using other tools of data collection. Now it's not Islam. I'm not going to do content analysis or discourse analysis of the texts. I'll be talking about Muslims. Oh, Muslims is another story. Then I might need to do focus group discussions, might need to do literature review, might need to do interviews, might need to do structured interviews. I might need to just do some kind of analysis of elites, Muslim elites. So here it is not Islam as a religion, it's Muslims and their culture, their worldview. Again, I'm starting from a topic that I found interesting for me, and now I'm going deeper to understand it by saying what that is making Islam good or Muslims. It depends on what kind of research you want to do, but the choice you make is consequential. It will have consequences later on. If you're going to talk about Islam, that's a story. If you're going to, you cannot have interviews with the text of Islam, but you can have interviews with Muslims. You can have interviews with those who preach Islam. So you need to be specific. And with Islam as a religion or Muslims as human beings, as beings who have cultures, thoughts, ideas, behavior, and so on. Okay, or you might not want to put it in the framework of a question. What's different between Islam and Christianity, or what's different between Islam and other religions? You might want to put it in a form of a hypothesis. That is, there is a causality that's happening. That is, the more Muslims are educated, Muslim countries or Muslim people are educated, the more they are receptive or hospitable to modernity. Here, it's a causal relationship. The more Muslims live in countries that are secular, the more they are hospitable or receptive or welcoming concepts of modernity, secularism, and democracy, and so on. So the idea here is it can be a hypothesis. The more people are educated, the more Muslims are educated, the less, for instance, they will be pro-applying Sharia, for instance. Again, this is a hypothesis. It's a relationship between two variables. Again, you will need to conceptualize what do you mean by educated. If you're more educated, so what do you mean by educated? Any kind of education, or you mean religious education or civil education, and so on. You need to be very specific, because eventually what I'll require, how would I know that your research is accurate or not accurate? If I can replicate it. In other words, if I go through the same steps one by one, that is, I do the same literature review, I do the same conceptualization, I do the same technique of data collection, I would get, I wouldn't say similar results, but at least results that are close enough to what you found. Okay, so you need to do something. You need to do conceptualization and variable structuring and hypothesis building in a way that if anybody else does the same exact thing like you will end up with somehow close, nearby results to what you found. Okay? When we design our research problem, we put it in the form of questions or hypothesis, we need to make sure that there are empirical, observable manifestations of it. Otherwise, you might be just daydreaming. If you tell me something, why Muslim countries are not democratic, you need to prove to me that your observation is accurate. Otherwise, you are examining something that does not exist. In other words, you need to tell me out of 193 countries of the world, this is the number of Muslim countries, and these are the number of Muslim countries that are democratic, and this is the number of Muslim countries that are not democratic. So now, I can relate to what you are saying. Now I understand that your research problem has manifestations. It's real problem that has empirical manifestations, observable manifestations. I can see where the problem is. If this gentleman, Macron, the president of France, says that Islam is in crisis, okay, what do you mean by crisis? You need to prove to me that really Islam is in crisis. It might not be in crisis. What if I come and say that Christianity is in crisis? Okay, show me, give me evidence that Christianity is in crisis. In other words, I need empirical / observable manifestations, tangible data to tell me that, yes, this research problem is real. It is not something that I'm imagining or I'm hoping for or I am fearing. No, it is something that really exists. The disease exists. You know, you need to prove me that this research problem exists in reality. Okay. After you tell me what your title is, in other words, what your topic is, and you formulate your research problem either as a question or group of questions or hypotheses, you need to tell me, okay, what if somebody else answered your question and your research is irrelevant, because whatever you are trying to do has been done. How would I know that? This is what we call literature. What do we already know about those who examined this topic before us? We need to know. Otherwise, I might find that, okay, I'm doing this piece of research, and I find, oh, there are like lots of scholarship, lots of research that has been done, and they answer the same question. So what are you going to add to us? Oh, nothing. If you are going to add nothing, then don't do it. Why do you do something that has already been done? Okay, we know, for instance, from so many pieces of research that democracies don't fight wars against each other. Okay, why? We can think about different dynamics or causality reasons why democracies don't fight wars against each other. But what's important for me is what previous research has said about that. If previous research is telling me that this phenomenon has been studied and overstudied, then why you are going to re-examine it? It's done. We know that. We know the causality. We know why it happens. We know all the aspects of it. Are you going to add something that we don't know, or you just reiterating it, retelling us the story again? No, if you are telling us the story again, no, thank you, because we have access to the scholarship, the research done before that. Okay, if no, and if the research before us was not enough, and you still have a gap or a hole that you intend to fill in this piece of research. If this is the case, we still need to know those before us did what and why they did not fill in this gap, why they failed to answer the question you have just formulated up here, or why they did not test the hypothesis you have put here. Why? That's why we need to understand not only what they did, but did they do well? In other words, you need to have some kind of evaluation of previous research. Because the problem here is if we lack the enough data about previous literature review, we might run into a problem that we are doing a piece of research on something that is not doable. You might ask a question that sounds very, very interesting, but no data exists. People before us failed to answer the same question because they did not find data. So you are doing the impossible. So as a mentor of yours, I have to tell you, no, watch out, don't do that, because you will be doing something that nobody ever did before you. If you have a topic that has no literature before you, most likely it is unstudiable. Nobody can study it, irresearchable. So we do literature review, number one, to make sure that whatever we are doing has data, has people before us who examined it, but left some area that was dark. We could not know more than what they knew. And now I have new technique, new way of data collection, new idea, new theoretical framework, new philosophy, new theory, new model, new whatever, something new that they did not have access to, and now you are going to help us understand something that they could not understand. One important thing about literature review, and I'll talk about that in more details later on, and this is a common mistake. Literature review is not a list of literature. It is not like X said 1, 2, 3, 4, Y, X, 5, 6, 7, and M said what? No. You are not just summarizing. You need to relate the literature to each other. You need to classify the literature. You can classify the literature saying these 5 pieces of research did 1, 2, 3 together. Not together meaning they would like. I mean, this classification, this category of research has something in, or this category of research has something in common. All of them, for instance, were more ideological, while these other 5 or 6 pieces of research were more empirical. While these other 3 or 4 pieces of research tried to examine the ideological studies empirical way. In economic development, from a governmental point of view, that is trying to see what the government said or did at the time. Another piece of research or another group of research or another literature is examining it from the perspective of capitalism and how capitalism is important and how it is effective and so on. A third group of research of literature has done it from a socialist point of view, saying that the state has intervened and that's why all these countries somehow are socialist, though they don't call themselves socialists. A fourth group of literature have been more technical, related to the real, how they used the interest rate, at what point of time, how they made a specific decision, and so on. So now, even when I'm talking about what? I'm talking about this relationship between the state and economic development as two variables of examination or examining, but the literature that handled this relationship took 4 categories. I do not want you to give me a list. Just A did one, B said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No. I don't want that. I want categorization of literature. So eventually I see the literature talking to each other. Because that's what will lead you eventually to say what? You know what? All this literature that talk to each other and came up with all this categorization are not enough. I am going to do something a bit different. What it is, you can just combine things together. You can say, I'm going to explore the literature and eventually come up with a new model, or even this model that was applied in South Korea, I'm going to apply it to in Taiwan, or I'm going to see why South Korea succeeded while Egypt did not succeed. You see, now you are doing something new. You are not just redoing what others did. If you are just redoing what others did, then there's no point of you doing your research. Number 4, we need to come up with a way. So when we do argumentation, when we build our arguments in our research and establish the causality, if there is causality, because not all research has this causality dynamic in it, we need to make sure that we are not committing any faults, any mistakes that would eventually lead us astray. Don't confuse the result with the cause. You need to make sure that you are not using terms interchangeably. So eventually you are examining democracy, but you are calling it liberalism. No, don't confuse terms. You need to be very specific. Is it democracy or is this liberalism? They might be together, but sometimes they might not be together. You see, when you talk about even democracies, okay, not democracies are all alike. Okay, when you talk about government designs or political system designs, some are presidential, some are parliamentary, and so on. So don't confuse terms, you see, because you might say that democracy leads to instability. Okay, so democracy is your independent variable and instability is your dependent variable. And so, but all democracies, or you are talking about specific types of democracies, emerging democracies or consolidated democracies. And this, again, the literature would tell you that not all countries are born democracies. And when they start their journey to become democracies, they start first as emerging democracies until peaceful transfer of power happens for 3 times at least, then eventually become consolidated democracies. So you need to make that, okay, democracies that are presidential or democracies that are parliamentary. Yes, I understand in our part of the world, in the Middle East, it happens that, for instance, Lebanon would stay without a government for like a year or so. Iraqi government after the elections was formed like almost 8 months. Okay, so this entry. Okay, what? That did not. You need to make sure that you do not confuse terms. You don't confuse cause with effect. You do not ignore literature or evidence that goes against your argument, because that's important. Okay, what if some of the evidence I'm examining goes against my argumentation? Would I just avoid it, put it under the rug? No, you need to bring it up and discuss it. and tell us why this kind of argumentation does not apply to your research. Or you might say, my research, I thought I'm studying all the cases. Now, with this piece of research that goes against my initial intention, I'm going to narrow down my piece of research. In other words, you need to make sure that you are not deceiving us when you are argumenting or establishing your causal relationship. Then you will move to the technicality of the process, of the research process. Now we will be using concepts. Concepts for you are like the blocks that you will be using to build a wall. Okay, what are these concepts you are using? What field you are discussing? Okay, wars. Okay, what's war? Is any kind of threat between two countries is a war? Or you mean by war something specific? Okay, what kind of war? Is it like international war, regional war, bilateral war? Is it a civil war? And so on. Would you consider terrorism part of war or not? So you need to conceptualize. This is the term conceptual framework and variable structure. You need to come up with a good array, a good matrix of concepts that we understand what you mean by them. Number one, part of your conceptualization is related to the literature review. How others before you used your concept. It is not a process that you will do inductively. I mean, you're not going to just sit somewhere in the library, look at the ceiling and come up with your own definition. No, you need to see how others before you define the concept. And you might use one of them. You see, along with X, I'm going to define the word war by the following, 1, 2, 3, 4. Because eventually I'm going to ask you to tell me about the manifestations of the concept. Don't come with a concept that would include everything. Anything is war. Assassination is war. Okay, so we killed, okay, so somebody killed somebody. Is this an act of war or this is just an assassination? So you need to be careful when you use your concepts. Okay, what are the manifestations? What are the classifications, if there are any? Not all democracies are alike. Not all capitalist states are alike. Not all Arab states are alike. Some of them are kingdoms, some of them are republics, and so on. So don't say Arabs. No, that's oversimplification. Okay, what do you mean by Arabs? Are Kurds Arabs? Like when you say Arabs, do you include with them Kurds of Iraq, Kurds of Syria? Or no, they are not Arabs, and so on. So you need to define your concepts in a way that I understand what you mean, based on others, or actually in the contrary of what others did. You might simply say none of the definitions I found in the literature would really suit my purpose. I'm going to redefine it in a different way. That's what we call stipulate your concept. Stipulate, come up with a stipulative definition that is for the purpose of this research. The word war means 1, 2, 3, 4. The word Arab means 1, 2, 3, 4. The word democracy means 1, 2, 3. And don't forget to classify again. Very important to classify, because major words, we live in a world full of big words. Media and social media can use the same word in so many different ways and means. So you need to be specific, otherwise we will find the same word would have different connotations in different contexts in your piece of research. So come up with one definition, stick to it from A to Z, either along one of the pieces of research that you examined when you were doing your literature review, or you are coming up with a fresh definition that you come up with. But of course, it has to have logic. You have to tell me why you came up with this definition, and none of the definitions that existed in the literature would serve your research. Okay, how are you going to measure, observe them? In other words, okay, concepts are not just words. They are technical terms that we use because eventually answer a question or test our hypothesis. That's why we need to measure or observe them. We cannot just come up with interesting, fancy, catchy words to describe a term, but eventually it has no meaning. Your conceptualization and variable structure need to be functional. In other words, would serve the function of your piece of research. So you need, if you are going to examine the word instability, okay, what do you mean by instability? Okay, come up with whatever definition. Okay, then you need to classify. Is it instability like high level instability, meaning coup d'etat or revolution, or low level instability, meaning sit-ins, meaning demonstrations? Okay, you need to be clear for what that. Okay, how are we going to measure that? How are we going to observe that? How would is Egypt stable or unstable nowadays? Is Libya stable or non-stable nowadays? Okay, so I need to come up not only with the concept in a clear definition and terms, but I need as well to come up with indicators, observable, measurable, so I can eventually say, oh yeah, if, for instance, if you are going to use quantitative terms, Libya is like unstable from in a scale from 1 to 10, Libya is 2. Okay, and Yemen is 1, and Egypt is 9, for instance. You see, now I can tell, oh, okay, so this means that Yemen is more unstable than Libya and stable than Egypt. Okay, so you need to come up with the way, so even, but this is not going to be just numbers. No, you need to you can measure that by saying, okay, I'm going to go through all the acts of violence, for instance. I'm going to use the violence, acts of violence as an indicator of instability. Okay, in